Greetings, brothers and sisters. I'm Professor Spira, and wanted to do another study session. This is our second study session where I take you into the text and kind of examine some things and take a look at some topics. And the topic I want to talk about today is mucus. You think that makes sense. Talk about the Mucusless Diet Healing System, but I want to talk specifically about mucus-forming foods and what that really means. And here we're going to look at the annotated mucusless diet as well as our edition of rational fasting. But first, let's take a look at Mucusless Diet Healing System, and I'm just going to actually kind of go through here. And so Eric talks about his mucus theory and is talks about constipation and some general ideas. And again, as I talk about down here where I want to go into the notes, constipation is not just bowel constipation, but it's also cellular constipation, constitutional encumbrances, if you will. But what I wanted to look at is say the word mucus. And we go down here and let's get a little information about what is mucus within the context of the Mucusless Diet Healing System. So the word mucus is from the Latin mucus, which means slime, mold, snot, etc. Mucus refers to a thick, viscous, slippery discharge that is comprised of dead cells, mucin, inorganic salts, water, and exfoliated cells. It also refers to the slimy, sticky, viscous substance left behind by mucus-forming foods in the body after ingestion. So when we talk about mucus, and this has been a topic, a couple of people have just recently asked this to me, and I've heard this a lot, because a lot of people talk about and view mucus-forming foods as being foods that create a lymphatic response, meaning foods that force the body to produce mucus, to have the mucous membrane secrete mucus in order to protect the body. The so-called immune systems involved in this, but this idea of mucus as a protective layer. When we talk about mucus forming foods, we're not talking about specifically foods that create this reaction from the body, although all forms of poison will do that, but we're not specifically talking about lymph, because a lot of people they will use the word mucus and lymph in sort of synonymously. When we talk about mucus forming foods, we are referring to foods now here that create or leave behind uneliminated mucus in the human body. Such foods include meat, dairy, grain, starches, and fats. So again, mucus forming refers to foods that create or leave behind. And that's a key thing to understand. These foods decompose into slimy slime and leave behind. Now, one of the things that came to mind in how this is best demonstrated. Some people like to argue with this because, we'll talk about it in a second. But to me, it just makes sense. It's very self-evident. And in rational fasting, there's a lot of gems in here, of course. And one of them is this concept of boiling something and seeing what happens to it. So here, Eric says, if potatoes, grain meal, rice, or the respective meat materials are boiled long enough, we receive jelly-like slime or mucus or paste used by bookbinders and carpenters. This mucus substance soon becomes sour, ferments, and forms a bed for fungi, molds, and bacilli. In process of digestion, which is nothing else but a boiling or a combustion, this slime or paste is being secreted in the same manner, and it goes on from there. But the thing to understand here, well, further down he says, if figs, dates, or grapes are boiled down thick enough, we will also receive a pap, which, however, does not turn to fermentation and never secretes slime, but which is called syrup. So if you take any kind of mucus-free fruit item and put a little bit of water and kind of boil it up a little bit, cook it up, mucus forming foods will turn to slime. Try that with rice. Get you some rice, get some water, put it in a pan, cover it up, and cook it for about an hour. And see if you like what's in there. Do the same thing with do the same thing with some fruit, some kind of fruit. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not specifically saying go do this. You want to watch it, because if you don't, I'm not giving you an exact experiment to say, well, do it for this much at this long. If you don't have enough in there, it's gonna if you don't have enough water or enough of the rice or whatever in there, it could start burning or something. But and if you do it too hot, but we're talking 98 degrees in theory. The body, 98 degrees. And I understand that there's other things involved in terms of the enzymes and things in the body, but this is supposed to be something simple. We're not trying to create some kind of peer-reviewed study, scientific study based on this. This is something that a child should be able to do. That's the simplicity of Eric's work. It's not about like you have to hold this to some kind of all this intellectualism, all this stuff. It's just very simple. When I was a child, I remember making Play-Doh and sculpting things out of rice, out of rice clay. We would make clay out of things like rice and milk and flour, a couple things, and it would make these things that you could make little figurines or do little kid things with it. And so just based on that, I remember how hard that got. When it dried, those little rice things, when it dried, it was as hard as a rock. And all it was the same things that people eat. It just cooked up, heated up, it was just sort of fashioned. It was let out to be able to dry. So the point is that when we're talking about mucus forming foods, we're not talking about foods that just irritate the mucosa. We're talking about foods that degrade into slime. Now, if you just have this real hardcore reaction against, it's just not scientific enough, there's air involved and it's not the same condition as it is in your stomach, or whatever excuse you got, the only other thing that you can do if you want to understand this is take some, put yourself on the experimentation table, take a mouthful of rice, and hold a mouthful of rice in your mouth for 20 minutes. I don't know. I really don't want you to do this. But imagine if you were to hold some rice in your mouth for about 20 minutes and then hold a mouthful of grapes for 20 minutes and see the difference between the two. See if the rice doesn't turn into slime right in your mouth, and see if the grapes don't just turn into just grape juice. It just turns into grape juice. If you could even stand to just hold something in your mouth, that'd be hard for me. I don't like holding something in my mouth that long. I guess some of the oil pulling people could probably do that because you get used to holding oil in your mouth for a long period of time. But that would be a way to do if you really just. My reaction to this is because I've gotten this a lot, where people say, "Well, that's an unscientific thing. Like, how can you prove that mucus-forming foods are really mucus-forming based on something that's so unscientific?" It's like, man, it's not meant to be some kind of peer-reviewed analysis. This is something that's supposed to be self-evident. It's supposed to make sense. Put a bunch of potatoes, put some meat, put whatever, and cook it up. Put a little water in it, cook it up a little bit, and see if it does it turn into syrup? Does it turn into something like honey? Or does it turn into slime? Does it turn into something that resembles snot? Pus or meat, so not, pus equals meat. it turns into slime. It doesn't burn clean away. It degrades into slime. And the sticky, slimy nature of these things, when they don't leave the body, which in most cases they don't, for people that are constipated, they have 32 feet of impacted intestines that have never done an enema or cleansed themselves, these things go in and they just add to the filth internally. And the body has all of these different ways of trying to combat this constipation, this cellular constipation, the buildup of waste, of uneliminated, undigested, unnatural food substances that are carried in the system from childhood on until you start to clean yourself up. And so yeah. So that was the main thing that I really wanted to talk about today. Oh, well, the one other thing would be, Eric does talk about lymph, albeit it's one time in rational fasting, but he says, and he's basically referencing this issue where people say, well, isn't mucus natural in the body? We're not talking about that type of mucus. In fact, I would prefer that we rename that. Instead of calling lymphatic secretion mucus, I just call it lymph fluid or lymphatic secretion, mucous membrane secretion. But instead of calling that mucus, at least within my realm, since I like to focus on mucus-forming foods and foods that turn into slime, then to not be confused, I would rather just call the things having to do with the lymphatic system lymph or lymph fluid. But what Eric says is, first of all, I maintain that in all diseases without exception, there exists a tendency by the organism to secrete mucus. And in case of a more advanced stage, such as pus, which is decomposed blood, of course, every healthy organism must also contain a certain mucus or lymph, fatty substance of the bowels, etc., of a mucus nature. Every expert will admit this in all catarrholic cases, from a harmless cold to the nose to inflammation of the lungs and consumption, as well as epilepsy attacks showing froth at the mouth of mucus. When this secretion of mucus does not show freely and openly, as in cases of ear, eye, skin, or stomach trouble, heart disease, rheumatism, gout, etc., even in all degrees of insanity, mucus is the main factor of the illness. The natural secretive organs, unable to cope with it longer, the mucus cope with it any longer, the mucus enters the blood, causing heat, inflammation, pain, and fever at the respective spot where the vessel system is probably contracted, owing to an overcooling fever or cold, heat, inflammation, pain, fever, etc. So he's saying right here that there is a natural so-called mucus. A better term to use would be lymph. So there is natural lymph as part of the body, as part of human physiology. What's not part and doesn't have to be part of your human physiology is pus, that uneliminated pus coming from pus-forming foods that have degraded into slime, your milks, your cheeses. You think the cheese just magically disappears and is digested? Well, it leaves behind slime. It decomposes into slime. The slime created from cheese is not to be confused for the natural lymphatic fatty substances of the bowels and the mucous membrane and the little bit of mucus that is excreted if you eat something like a lemon in your mouth, and if you're your lymph system isn't filtering great, you might get a mouthful of mucus. The lemon did not create that mucus. That was an expression of elimination by way of your mucous membrane, by way of your lymphatic system. So this is just something I wanted to kind of talk about. I really need to make a blog post about this. I've been planning on doing that for a while. I've responded with this information several times on different places, from YouTube videos to blogs and that kind of thing. And usually people make sense pretty quickly, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We really have to get this together. We have to be very clear on this, so that when people say that, you have to tell them, when we're talking about mucus forming foods, we're not talking about foods that stimulate the lymphatic system, because mucus-free and mucus-forming foods both can elicit a lymphatic response. Now, one is cleansing in nature, and the other is constipating in nature or obstructive in nature. But you can eat almost anything, and depending on what's going on with your body and your lymphatic system, you can have a lymphatic response. So this is something that I really hope that we can get clear on this, and that this video can help clarify that just a little bit. So thank you all for tuning in, and until next time, peace, love, and breath.
Don't you put it in your mouth, till you ask someone you love. That's right, sis. If it's okay to eat, like a muffin or meat. If you don't know just what it is, remember, boys and girls, don't put it in your mouth.
So let's eat smart.
Now we know.
And knowing is half the battle.